So growing up, before I got into rewilding, if you'd have said to me the word squirrel, my mind would have immediately have gone to the grey. And I'm pretty sure that's the same for most Brits, you know, whether if you're living in central London or if you're in like a suburban town or in any woodland, you're going to see a grey squirrel. But if I'd have been growing up before the year 1876, the squirrel which I'd have thought about is this one. This is the Eurasian red squirrel, and until that time it was the only squirrel living here in Britain. And for grey squirrels, you know, on the surface looking at them, you think they're pretty sweet, fluffy and harmless. And while those first two are true, they are actually a massive problem here in Britain. They're not only a problem for our native reds, but they're a problem for our woodlands, for our trees. And why is this? Well, grey squirrels are just built different. North American grey squirrels were never meant for European ecosystems. They're stronger, they're bigger, they're even smarter. Universities here in the UK actually tested red and grey squirrels. They tested their IQ and their ability to access nuts, and well, the greys, they just came out on top. And besides this, the greys also carry a deadly disease known as squirrel pox, which in most cases doesn't even affect them, but it is fatal to the reds. And red squirrels here in Britain, they are passionately supported and protected. I'd say almost fiercely. You know, whether if it's dedicated breeding programs or managing habitats specifically for reds, or if it's to limit greys by trapping them or indeed giving them contraceptives. Yes, contraceptives. This is something which we're looking into here in Britain. But there's also been a really quite exciting and natural development, which is as the pine marten has been returning to Britain, we've actually seen this species help the reds. But it's not just Britain that has grey squirrels. Italy is the only other country on the continent to have them. And research has shown, simulations have been ran, that it's only a matter of time before these squirrels expand off out into Europe. And actually, while we're mentioning Europe, we very nearly got ourselves the camper van, which is going to take us on the road and into Europe to keep making these videos. It's very exciting. If you want to know more about it, follow and support, you can do this over on Patreon. And I also must say a big thank you to Dan, as he sent through a lot of the squirrel footage you'll see in this video. Dan creates in-depth and beautifully shot wildlife documentaries here on YouTube that take him, you know, over a year to create, as he captures everything himself. This kind of filmmaking is underappreciated here on YouTube, so do go and subscribe to his channel, Handmade Wildlife Films. Now, it's no surprise that it was in fact people that introduced grey squirrels to Britain. In 1876, Thomas Brocklehurst released 2 squirrels to Cheshire. Now, these were originally pets, but I guess as the squirrels got older and they got less cute, they became a little bit less tolerable to keep. And over the next 50 years, more and more squirrels were released in England, often with the intent of trying to establish a wild population, sometimes releasing hundreds at one time. But please do keep in mind that it only takes several to actually establish a population. And over the course of the last century, grey squirrels very slowly but surely established themselves from the southeast of England all the way up to northern England. And they did make it into Wales and Scotland, although it wasn't quite as a comprehensive invasion. Now, the grey is native to North America, where it is an essential part of the ecosystem, both as a food source to predators above it, but primarily due to seed dispersal. You see squirrels, grey squirrels, they go out and they collect seeds and they store them around the forest. But overseas here in Britain, they play a largely different role. Now, I'm not disputing that they would sometimes end up on the menu for a large bird of prey, but the thing is, you know, we've lost many of our large land predators. You know, a lynx would be the animal which I would have thought would be capturing squirrels, but you know, they've long been extinct. And for our woodlands, while they do still store and collect nuts, they also strip the bark from our trees. This is a behaviour which is less observed in North America, but over here in Britain, well, they do it because they feed on the rich tissues under the bark of the tree. So in younger trees, they can end up being rimbarked. Like, unlike this like huge old oak tree, in younger trees they have a much thinner stem. And what happens is the bark can quite easily be removed all the way around the stem, and this limits the nutrient flow up and down the stem. And this kills the tree. And this damage costs the forestry industry something like £38 million every year. And for the wider economy here in the UK, it is that staggering £1.8 billion. And for context, there's something like 2.5 million grey squirrels across Britain. But what about our native reds? Well, we have an estimated 140,000 red squirrels living here in Britain, but this is just a fraction of the number that would have lived here before the greys arrived. The Eurasian red squirrel in Britain acts a lot like the grey squirrel does over in North America. They spread seeds, regenerating woodlands. The reds actually have a special adaptation to do this to pine trees, which the greys don't. And you can bet that once upon a time the reds would have been on the menu for the Eurasian lynx. You can almost see them now, ambushing them in our woodlands and in our forests. Two very charismatic animals with beautiful ear tufts. And it's these ear tufts and their red colour which set them apart from the greys. Plus the greys are larger too. And due to occupying the same niche in the ecosystem, the larger greys, well, they just outcompete the reds. And the study which looked into the two squirrels' cognitive abilities, this was done by the Edinburgh and the Exeter universities here in the UK. This study had the squirrels pulling and pushing levers in order to get to nuts. And it turns out that 91% of the time the grey squirrels got to the nuts, and only 62% of the time the red squirrels actually got to the nuts. So the greys, as well as being bigger and stronger and smarter than the reds, they do carry this virus known as squirrel pox. Now the greys actually carry this. In very few cases does this actually affect the greys, but in almost every case it is fatal to the reds, and this has been a key contribution to their decline. But the reds do have something of a stronghold the further north you go in the UK. I've frequently seen them up in Scotland, and here habitats are managed to be most suitable for the reds and, less suitable for the greys. One method of doing this is ensuring that there are some woodlands where it's just pines. You see, because the reds like them and the greys don't. Here, conservationists are making sure that there is a good diversity of different age pines so that they're always coming into seed. And also creating islands, so making sure that greys can't pass through and enter into these areas where reds are. So this might be segregating them with arable land, moorland, or rows of conifers. Now, although these methods do ensure that some local populations of reds can continue to survive, they just aren't a sure way of dealing with the threat from greys. Now, whether if it's to ensure that the reds have a chance or that trees and woodlands are protected, there are two main other ways of managing grey squirrels, and they broadly fall into two buckets: shooting and trapping. Almost in both cases, the grey squirrels, they end up dead. Sometimes the wrong animals can actually be caught in the traps as well. While these forms of management are deemed as effective, they're also really costly. But interestingly, there is another method emerging which is beginning to displace and upset the greys. The pine marten is making a return to Britain, and in the areas where the pine marten is beginning to overlap with the greys and the reds, we're beginning to see the greys fall back. We're beginning to see them decline. A study in Scotland looking at 3 different regions has actually been collecting the hairs of reds, greys and pine martens. They've done this using sticky patches next to baited feeders. These hairs were then forensically tested, which has enabled researchers to identify individuals, and therefore we can understand how they're moving around and how they're influencing one another, finding that the pine martens actually had a strong negative effect on grey squirrels and a positive effect on red squirrels. Is the pine marten the solution to helping the reds make a comeback and also take a dent into that £1.8 billion that we spend every year on grey squirrels? Maybe. But here's the thing, this issue with grey squirrels isn't just a problem here in Britain, they're also on the continent of Europe. Italy is the only country in Europe to have grey squirrels. Now, the greys haven't been in Italy for as long as they've been in Britain. Back in 1997, the Italian government wanted to try and eradicate them while the population was still quite small and manageable. But this plan to try and eradicate them was met with some pretty strong protests from animal rights activists. And so the whole plan was delayed and the greys were able to establish, and now they're expanding and they're spreading and they're beginning to displace the reds, just like they've done here in Britain. And dispersal simulations have actually shown that the greys will eventually expand off out through the Alps and into neighbouring countries by the year 2066. The pine marten is still pretty widespread throughout Europe, and they also have a lot of other animals, like the lynx, which, it has had a hard history, but it is beginning to make a comeback in many areas across Europe. And I just wonder how this will affect the grey squirrels. And here in the UK, where we've got a lot more grey squirrels, we are actually look at giving them a contraceptive. I don't think we've done this yet, and we'll be delivering it orally through like a species-specific mechanism, probably some kind of feeder which the greys will go up to and they'll have a little lick. In the long term, I guess this is more cost effective, and it's certainly a lot more humane than killing them. But what are your thoughts on this? Do you think grey squirrels should be given contraception? Do you think they should be trapped and shot? Do you think we should just leave them to it and just let nature be and stop always interfering? Or do you think we should introduce some of our missing species, particularly in the context here in Britain, like pine martens and lynx, and just see what happens? Stuff is moving really quickly with the camper van and the whole Europe plan, so do go over to Patreon to get all of the content on that as it happens. If you want to keep watching the channel, then please do check out the video that's on the screen now. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. Leave curious.